SNRIs inhibit the reuptake process of a different neurotransmitter known as norepinephrine. So as I think you're kind of getting the sense, there are tons of different neurotransmitters, far more than we have time to go over within the scope of this class. Rather, the ones that I want you to know for your first exam are in this table. And we can take it from the top. First up, acetylcholine, or ACH for short. One of the primary functions of acetylcholine is motor control over your muscles. We're talking about being able to move muscles and body parts like hands, feet, neck, torso, or even your facial muscles to help you make facial expressions of emotion. To give you an application, many older individuals may use Botox to help prevent wrinkles in their face. And the way in which Botox works is that it inhibits acetylcholine in the facial muscles. However, over repeated Botox use, it could eventually get to the point where older individuals start experiencing a paralysis of their facial muscles, which could leave them with an emotionless face over time, or a face that's maybe, stuck in a certain facial expression of emotion, which perhaps goes without saying, not very desirable. Next up, we got norepinephrine. Norepinephrine's primary function is arousal and alertness. Starting first with arousal. When you hear the word arousal, you're probably thinking something somewhat analogous to, say, sexual arousal. And although that's certainly one way that you could define arousal, psychologists take a much broader definition of what arousal is. It could come in the form of stress, anxiety, emotionality, adrenaline, anger, right? Anything that's amping your body up and getting you going could be considered a form of arousal. And this arousal that we experience can have downstream consequences on your ability to focus, pay attention, and stay alert. As an example, we have a lot of evidence in educational psychology to suggest that when college students go into a challenging exam feeling a moderate, normal, and healthy degree of anxiety, they actually do a little bit better on that exam. Because that anxiety is telling them, hey, there's something important to focus on, you need to think about that. But as you can imagine, college students going into a challenging exam feeling way too much or way too little anxiety can detract away from their performance. If you go into an exam feeling way too much anxiety, now your attention is so wrapped up in this fear of failure that you're not focusing on what you need to focus on to do well. Or if you go into your exam feeling way too little anxiety, now you're so nonchalant, you're so laid back, you're not focusing and remembering the types of things you need to remember to do well. There's actually a sweet spot in anxiety as we find research. It's not all bad. It can actually help you focus in normal, healthy, and moderate levels on the things that are important. Next up is serotonin. We talked about serotonin briefly before, right? We know deficits in serotonin are often associated with anxiety, depression, impulsivity, emotionality, eating problems, sleep problems, sometimes even aggressiveness. And many individuals may take SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to inhibit the reuptake process of serotonin and encourage more flow into the brain. Related to serotonin is dopamine. You've probably heard of this one before, right? It's the happy chemical in our brain. Right? It is. The primary function of dopamine is reward and motivation. So whenever something good happens to you, right, you get a good grade on your test, you get promoted at your job, somebody likes or comments on your posts on social media, right? You get a small surge of dopamine in your brain, makes you feel good, but also motivates you to do that same thing again to feel good again. Right? However, as we're going to see shortly in today's class, dopamine can also have downstream consequences on addiction. Because I want that thing so badly that it starts becoming excessive, and it could be at a detriment to my well-being. Dopamine, though, also has a less well-known function. It's also associated with helping you move your body. Remember, dopamine isn't just making you feel good, it's also motivating you to go and do that thing again. So you can bet that because dopamine is motivating you to do that thing again, there's going to be implications for you moving your body, right, to get that thing. Dopamine helps you move your arms, your legs, your feet, your hands. And if you have deficits in dopamine, that can potentially put you at risk for developing the early onset of Parkinson's disease, which is associated with stiffness, hand tremors, just generally having trouble moving. Right? Dopamine is linked to it. GABA. The primary function of GABA is inhibiting your action potentials. You guys have seen this word before, right? Action potentials, and we just talked about it, refers to the firing and wiring of neural communication. So if you slow down action potentials, and thereby slow down the firing and wiring of neural connections, that's going to have downstream consequences on slowing down your information processing speed and efficiency. A part of the reason why alcohol is a depressant and makes you tired, lethargic, and also slows and disrupts your information processing is because alcohol releases GABA that has this type of effect on your cognition, right? Disrupting and slowing your information processing speed. If GABA slows things down for you, glutamate speeds it up. Glutamate is associated with enhancing your action potentials, right? Because action potentials are associated with the firing and wiring of neural communication. If you speed this up, you're also going to see downstream consequences on speeding up your information processing speed. It's going to affect everything ranging from your ability to pay attention, to sense, to perceive, learn, remember, think intelligently, your judgment, your decision making, your ability to improvise. A lot of the cognitive abilities that are good for students like you guys. And it turns out there's a lot of natural ways we can release glutamate in our brain. One way is through consuming healthy foods. There's a lot of fruits and vegetables and many proteins, in fact, that naturally stimulate glutamate in our brains. So it turns out there may be something, that common notion your doctors told you about when your kid's like, hey, eat something before you go to school, right? Because if you eat something healthy before you go to school, we could see an increase in glutamate and an incremental effect on your cognitive performance. But this isn't necessarily to say that eating something before you go to school is going to be the be-all, end-all of your ability to do well in school. In fact, just as anecdotal evidence, I was never somebody to eat breakfast before school, and I kind of did just fine, I think. Rather, this is primarily for people who are trying to min-max their life and squeeze as much self-improvement as possible out of their performance. Lastly, endorphins. This is probably one of the other neurotransmitters you've at least heard of a little bit before. You may know it as the body's natural pain reliever, and it is. Its primary purpose is pain reduction. Most commonly talked about endorphin releasers are things like opioids, like heroin, morphine. but those have really addictive properties, right? Fortunately, there are more natural ways we can release endorphins in our brain as well. Take physical activity. It turns out when athletes get hurt on the playing field, they may not realize the true extent of their injury in that moment. Because when they're engaging in all that physical activity, their adrenaline is pumping and so forth. There are endorphins being released in their brain, which are numbing their pain signals. In fact, that athlete may not realize how hurt they actually are until they go back to the locker room after the game is over, and they say to themselves, wow, I didn't realize how hurt I actually was. I was just, playing through the pain, right? So there might be something, that common notion your coaches may have told you growing up, where, hey, just walk it off, you'll be fine, right? Because when you walk it off, you are engaging in a small degree of physical activity that can have an incremental reduction on the amount of pain you feel. Social connections. Good, happy, healthy social connections also reduce your pain. There's something about social relationships that have a protective buffer against your pain. Supporting this, we find that couples can actually hold their hand in an ice-cold bucket of water for longer and also report less pain from that ice-cold bucket of water if they're holding their partner's hand with their other free hand. Relating. Women who are relating, giving birth, may have a natural inclination to hold their partner's hand. Because when they hold their partner's hand, we see an increase in endorphins in their brain, and it makes the pain of childbirth a little bit more tolerable for them. Touch goes a long way. I think that's pretty cool. Any questions on any of these?
These are just the common. These are the transmitters you want us to learn for exam.
Yeah, and to give you an idea of what I could ask you, right? I could give you a fictional scenario where I say, hey, Jody feels really good because she got a good grade on her test. Which neurotransmitter is most closely associated with Jody's positive feeling? And of course, in an A, B, C, or D type of format, you'd be looking for dopamine. Right? That's how I would be asking you these types of questions. You don't have to necessarily remember these by heart. In most circumstances, these neurotransmitters will be choices or options that you can pick from. And there'll be scenarios that will be linked to them. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to zoom out a bit. Talk about the different divisions of our nervous system. The first big division of our nervous system is the central nervous system. The central nervous system has two components: the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. Two big components, but that's it. Your brain and your spinal cord. Starting first with your spinal cord. Your spinal cord is responsible for transmitting information from your body to your brain, and then vice versa, from your brain to your body. You can think of the spinal cord as kind of like your mind's information superhighway, relaying information back and forth from your brain to your body, and from your brain to your body to your brain. In fact, we can go back to the stubbing of your toe example. When you stub your toe on that chair or that table, you have neurons in your feet which take that signal up your leg, up your spinal cord, into your brain for further processing. And then after your brain processes it, you feel pain, you say ow, and then it goes back down from your brain, down your spinal cord to your hand to respond to your environment. Your spinal cord was at the heart of what enabled that signal to go from your foot to your brain, and then from your brain to your hand. So if you break this thing, you can bet you're going to see significant disruption in your mind-body communication and potentially leave you paralyzed or worse, dead. So you heard it here first, folks. Don't break this thing. It's important. The next component of your central nervous system is your brain. And as you can see in this illustration, your brain is divided up into three main regions. And because your brain is divided into three main regions, that leads us to one of the most important assumptions in neuroscience history, that your brain is highly specialized. We have different parts of your brain controlling different types of psychological activity and behavior. The pattern that you are going to see is that these lower portions of your brain are responsible for your body's most basic survival functions. But as we creep up higher to the uppermost regions of your brain, we start getting closer to higher level orders of thinking and intelligence, and some cognitive capabilities that are uniquely human. Survival, advanced thought. That's the pattern. So we can take it from the bottom. The hindbrain, the oldest brain region, also known as the brain stem, but we're just going to call it the hindbrain. It is said by evolutionary psychologists to have evolved first in human history because it's associated with our body's most basic survival functions. By survival functions, we're talking about everything ranging from breathing, heart rate, digestion, sleep, arousal, survival functions. As an application, a part of the reason why people can survive on life support, despite the fact that the uppermost regions of their brain are brain dead, is because their hindbrain may still be working and intact, allowing their heart to still beat on its own. They may still be able to breathe on their own. Their stomach may still be digesting food on its own, even though they might as well be in a vegetative state. As you can see in this visual illustration here, the hindbrain has three main regions. Get this one for a second. Three main regions. The pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. For the purposes of our class, you don't have to remember these. You don't have to remember the pons or the medulla. But what I would like you to keep in mind, because we're going to talk about this brain region later on in the semester, is the cerebellum, which is a part of the hindbrain. The cerebellum, which is a part of the hindbrain, is associated with balance and motor coordination. Balance and motor coordination. So a part of the reason why people who are intoxicated, drunk, have a difficult time walking a straight line is because that alcohol temporarily disrupts activity in their cerebellum, which can make it difficult to perform that task. Or for those of you that watch sports, boxing more specifically, you may hear analysts say things like, oh man, that boxer, he's punch drunk. Well, part of the reason that boxer may be punch drunk is because they get hit behind the ears. And when you get hit behind the ears, that can disrupt activity in your cerebellum and make it difficult for that boxer to maintain their balance and stay upright. Now, I'm no boxing aficionado, but I believe that's why there's also regulations against hitting boxers behind the head. Because not only can you disrupt their balance and give you an unfair advantage, but you could also kill them. Right? You can hit them hard enough in the right spot. Moving up to the middle part of your brain now. Your midbrain contains something known as the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra, which is in your midbrain, is responsible also for helping you move your body. Helping you move your body. Again, moving your arms, your legs, your feet, your torso, your neck. With that in mind, who remembers a neurotransmitter that we just got finished talking about that has a less well-known function associated with moving your body? We just talked about it. Yes?
Is it dopamine?
Dopamine, exactly. You guys are on it. There's a lot of dopamine production that takes place in the substantia nigra. So if this gets damaged and disrupts dopamine production in this part of the brain, that can disrupt your ability to move. And at worst, put you at risk for developing Parkinson's disease, which is associated with deficiencies in dopamine. Right? Stiffness, hand trouble, tremors, and generally having trouble moving. Any questions on these lower regions of the brain? Survival, movement. Okay. Well, now we get to the upper and largest part of our brain. A region of our brain so large that it's further divided into two separate regions. The forebrain. The first region of our forebrain is the subcortical region, which is right below the uppermost layer. The subcortical region of your forebrain contains a system known as the limbic system. And your limbic system also has different components. Divisions, among divisions, among divisions. The first part of your limbic system is the thalamus. The thalamus is responsible for processing sensory information. It's responsible for processing sensory information. We're talking about being able to process what you see, hear, taste, touch. You guys remember stubbing of your toe? When you stub your toe on that chair or that table, those signals go from your feet, up your leg, up your spinal cord, to your brain for further processing. The first place where those signals go for processing is the thalamus. Your thalamus processes sensory experiences. The lone exception to this rule is actually smell. Smell is our only sense, the only one that bypasses the thalamus completely. And up to this point in research, we really only have speculation as to why. But some evolutionary psychologists argue that smell evolved first in our evolutionary history before the thalamus was developed, which is why smell bypasses it completely and goes to the part of our brain that handles smell-related information. But that's just kind of speculation. What you need to know for your exam is that sensory experiences generally are first processed. Next up is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is associated with helping you form memories. Memory. It helps you remember everything ranging from facts, dates, names, events, your high school graduation, when you got your driver's license, your first kiss, whatever it may be, right? And it turns out you can work out your hippocampus kind of like working out a muscle on your body. The more we use it, the better your memory can get. In fact, people who work in jobs or careers that involve a lot of memory and therefore have greater hippocampus activity, say like doctors, surgeons, lawyers, even your teachers, end up being in a better position to stave off early onset of memory-related disorders like Alzheimer's. Now, I say stave off early onset because we also find that if you have a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's, practicing your memory can help stave that off a little bit, but chances are high you still could experience it at some point. It's a genetic predisposition. So if the hippocampus is associated with helping you form new memories, the amygdala sears emotional memories into your mind so that you never forget them, especially fearful and threatening memories. The amygdala sears emotional memories into your mind, especially fearful and threatening memories. Trauma, even perhaps. The amygdala is the reason why I can still remember almost drowning when I was a kid. Right? Because when that happened to me, which was a very fearful and threatening event, there was likely a lot of amygdala activation going on in my brain, which was responsible for searing that memory into my mind, where even still today, I remember it like it was yesterday. Kind of scary. To that end, we find a lot of anxiety disorders are related to amygdala activation, like PTSD. It's a part of the reason why when many soldiers come back to the mainland now as veterans, they could be set into a panic when they hear fireworks during the 4th of July. Because those fireworks bring back all of those old wartime memories that terrorize them, right? The amygdala is a part of that. They remember it like it was yesterday. Flashbacks to the war. Lastly, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for regulating your needs, wants, and drives. It regulates your needs, wants, and drives. We're talking about everything like your need for food, water, sex, sleep. And you may note that when you satisfy those needs, when you get food, you get water, you get sex, you feel good, right? There's a lot of dopamine production that also takes place here. But dopamine can have downstream consequences on addictions to some of these things. Let me give you an example. Olds in 1951 rigged a rat's hypothalamus up to a stimulation pedal where every time the rat pressed this pedal, it would get a surge of activity to its hypothalamus, making it feel good and making it want to press this lever again, but so much so that the rat would walk across this electrified grid, literally electrocuting itself just to get that same feeling again. Clearly showing some signs and patterns of what we think about as addiction, right? The organism is continuing to engage in a behavior even though it's producing detriments to its well-being. And human beings aren't that far away from this type of behavior. Human beings will engage in a whole slew of self-destructive actions like drugs, alcohol, smoking, drinking, and many others, all to get some sort of experience in their minds. Just like these rats wanting to press that lever, despite it hurting them. To give you an example that perhaps sits even closer to home, we find that the same neural pathways that activate for drug and alcohol addiction also activate for people who are excessively using their phones and on social media, implying that people can become addicted to almost anything because residing within our brains are the neural pathways that make this type of behavior possible. Now, of course, some objects are more addictive than others. Some people have more addictive personalities than others. But the point still stands. You give the right object, the right person, at the right time, and stuff like this is possible, which is kind of scary. Any questions on anything we talked about? Yeah.
Can you be addicted to literacy?
Sure. Right? There's tons of examples of people continuing to pursue individuals obsessively, even when it's no longer good for them or the person that they're pursuing, right? You even think of stalkers. They can't give it up, right? mean, to that point, there's a reason why social media itself ends up being the aspect of our phones that is the most engaging, right? The thing that draws us in the most, the thing that's the hardest to say no to. Because when people are trying to get my attention, and there's that red dot on my phone, I feel like I can't help but check it out. Am I missing out on something? If I don't respond, are people gonna think I'm bad at them? Right? These are things that may go on in my brain. I can't stop. Okay. Keep that in mind when we eventually get to that written assignment on digital well-being. Right? This is all very relevant for that second paper you're gonna write. Okay. So the other region of our forebrain is the cortical region. The cortical region contains something known as the cerebral cortex. And as you can see with this top-down view of the brain, the cerebral cortex has two hemispheres. You have the left hemisphere of your brain and the right hemisphere of your brain. And if you're paying especially close attention, you'll see that there is a small gap in between the hemispheres of your brain. That small gap in between the hemispheres of your brain is known as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the gap in between these hemispheres. And its purpose is to connect the hemispheres of your brain together, but also encourage communication between the hemispheres of your brain via neural fibers and axons. So in other words, inside this gap are a bunch of neural connections that enable the left hemisphere to communicate with the right, and the right hemisphere to communicate with the left. And if those neural fibers and axons weren't here, you wouldn't have any communication between the hemispheres of your brain, and that perhaps goes without saying, would be really bad. And we'll find out some case studies of people like that very shortly. Now, we've learned a lot from this corpus callosum. One thing we learned is that your brain is contralateral, which is just a fancy term for saying that mind-body communication is inversely related to one another. Your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. Your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And that probably flies in the face of a lot of intuition that's telling you all, hold on, I would think that the left hemisphere would control the left side of my body, but the right hemisphere would control the right side of my body. But that's not how it works. Mind-body communication is the complete opposite of what you'd expect. And up to this point in research, we really don't know why our brain works like this. The evolutionary purpose that it serves. It just does. But despite that, we've learned a lot from split brain patients. These split brain patients are people, as their name implies, who have had damage to their corpus callosum, where they no longer have any communication between their hemispheres of their brain. Imagine, metaphorically speaking, if somebody just took a giant knife and sliced through all the neural fibers and axons in between the hemispheres of your brain. Aside from the fact that that'd be really bad, you would be a split brain patient. No communication back and forth. So what have we learned from these people? We've learned that different parts of your brain are responsible for different types of psychological activity and behavior. Your brain is highly specialized. Different parts do different things. Your left hemisphere of your brain is responsible for speech and language production. Being able to say words, string those words into sentences. We're also simultaneously keeping in mind the rules of grammar, syntax, that we all take for granted on a day-to-day basis. Your right hemisphere, on the other hand, is associated with spatial reasoning, spatial judgment, being able to judge something's height, weight, length, distance from yourself, its position in space. Now, in a typical split brain patient study, a split brain patient is shown two options. One in the left visual field, like a pencil, and the other in the right visual field, like an apple. Now, because this apple is in the right visual field, it's being processed by the left hemisphere of your brain. And because the left hemisphere of our brain is associated with speech and language production, split brain patients can tell you that that thing is an apple, verbally. But because there's no communication with the right hemisphere of the brain, they literally can't judge its spatial dimensions. They can't tell you its height, its weight, its length, its distance from the self, its position in space. They can't do it. Because the pencil is in the left visual field, it's being processed by the right hemisphere of the brain. So split brain patients can tell you here, it can report its height, weight, length, distance from the self, but because there's no communication with the left hemisphere of the brain, they're literally unable to verbally tell you it's a pencil. They know what it is. They can make judgments about it, but they can't verbally tell you it's a pencil, which is wild to think about. Right? So we learned three important things from this type of research. The first of which is there's a small gap in between the hemispheres of your brain, known as the corpus callosum. The second of which is that your brain is contralateral. Left controls the right, right controls the left. And finally, that your brain is highly specialized. This thing is doing something a little bit different than this thing. Any questions on split brain patients and what we learned from them? Spanning across both your left and right hemispheres are also different lobes of your brain, which roughly correspond to different sensory experiences. They roughly correspond to different sensory experiences. Your occipital lobe, which is in the back part of your brain, is responsible for processing visual information. It helps you see. Now, as you can imagine, if you damage your occipital lobe, that could potentially cause blurry vision, or in extreme consequences, blindness. However, more commonly, we see that trouble seeing or blindness is typically caused by damage to the structures and components of your eye itself, like your retina or your optic nerve. But your occipital lobe is just another factor in the chain of command, where if it gets damaged, it can disrupt your vision. Your temporal lobe is associated with processing auditory information. It helps you hear. So yet again, if you damage your temporal lobe, that could cause trouble hearing or deafness. But in the same way with the visual system, more commonly we find that trouble hearing is usually associated with damage to the structures and components of your ears, like your eardrum or the hair cells inside your ears. But this is just another factor in the chain of command that helps you hear, where if it gets damaged, it could cause trouble hearing. The parietal lobe is associated with processing touch and pain sensations. We can go back finally to the stubbing of your toe example. You stub your toe on that chair or the table, signal goes up your leg, up your spinal cord to your brain for further processing. Who remembers the structure of your brain that those touch and pain sensations first go to? Yep. Thalamus. After it's processed by the thalamus, it then goes to the part of your brain that more specifically handles touch and pain sensations, your parietal lobe. But it goes to the thalamus first. But that's not terribly interesting. Let me give you a more intriguing statistic. Over 80% of college students report feeling something known as phantom phone vibrations at least twice a week, where they report feeling like their phone is vibrating near a part of their body when it never actually vibrated. Anyone have that experience before? Raise your hand. Feeling like your phone vibrated when it never did? Right? Me too. The reason why this happens is that your mind gets so used to this thing vibrating near a part of your body that sometimes your sensory systems will misfire and send a signal to your brain telling you that something vibrated when it never actually happened. Even more extremely, other people report feeling phantom limb syndrome, where they feel a sensation in a part of their body that doesn't even exist. This is most common among people who've most recently had an amputation, because their mind still contains a mental map of their entire body. So once again, their sensory systems can misfire and report a signal to their brain telling them they had a sensation in their arm, if their arm doesn't even exist anymore. The greater implications of this is that touch and pain experiences, as you experience it in your everyday lives, is far more psychological than physical. Touch and pain isn't happening on your finger like you think it is. It's happening in your brain. And if those signals don't get to your brain, you don't feel pain. Simple as that. And if that doesn't make sense yet, it will eventually will when we get to our dedicated topic on sensation perception. But keep that back in your head. It's an interesting thing. Lastly, frontal lobe. The largest lobe. The lobe that's responsible for higher level orders of thinking and intelligence. Uniquely human cognitive capabilities like thinking, intelligence, planning, organization, perspective taking, self-control, forecasting your emotions, you name it. The list goes on and on and on. So because this is so critical to the human experience, if you damage this thing, that's going to cause a lot of problems in your daily life function. Let me give you an example. I can tell you the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker back in the 1800s who had a metal rod pierced through his skull and out the other end. Now, as you can imagine, Phineas Gage was immediately rushed to a surgeon who proceeded to remove the metal rod from his skull. And to everybody's surprise, outside of being in severe pain, he was kind of okay. He was still sensing, perceiving, learning, remembering, thinking intelligently. But there was one aspect of Gage's cognition that was significantly impaired. That metal rod pierced the prefrontal cortex of his frontal lobe, disrupting his ability to control his emotions. So as a consequence, Gage became very impulsive, erratic, easily angry, insulting. To his friends and family members, Gage was no longer Gage. He was a completely different person, and his personality changed completely. More evidence that your brain is highly specialized. We have different parts of your brain that control different types of psychological experiences. In this case, that metal rod pierced through his prefrontal cortex that disrupted his ability to control his emotions. Any questions on his story? Find that intriguing or interesting? Yeah, what do you got?
So, he couldn't feel fear anymore, right? I believe that was one of the things.
Yeah, so he was having trouble with his emotions, experiencing them, but also most notably for our purposes today, controlling them, right? So he'd be blurting things out. He'd be expressing emotions that were inappropriate for the context or setting, right? He lost the ability to control those emotional experiences. Exactly. It just happened.
So what happened to him?
That's a great question. Phineas Gage, as far as I remember from the case study, did live a pretty happy, healthy life outside of having a lot of severe social problems. As you can imagine, not being able to control your emotions in public is going to put a damper on your ability to coordinate your actions alongside one. Yes.
So the frontal lobe is just
Frontal lobe is more or less higher level orders of thinking and intelligence. In this case, controlling his emotions. Is there another hand? Yes.
How did it, like, what happened? How did the rock pierce his head?
I don't quite remember. I gotta refresh my memories on the case study. But he was a railroad worker.
They had to blow something up and the rod went through his skull.
There you go. He's got the details on the history of this. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, if you just told them to do something stupid or so he'd be acting on impulse, on his emotions. So if his emotions were compelling him to do or say something,
Do it no matter
he
what.
would do. Right? There wouldn't be that inhibition system that would kick in and say, no, not okay. Right? If he didn't like you, if he thought something bad about you, he'd tell you. Right? We talk about people and you have no filters. This man had no filters. Like literally had no filters. Very insulting, easily angry. Now the next logical question that stems from this though is it possible for people to recover from really serious forms of brain damage like this, right? And the short answer is yes, but it depends. And it depends if you're a child. Children benefit from this critical period known as neuroplasticity, the rapid firing and wiring of neural connections that help the brain recover from damage, especially early on in life. The rapid firing and wiring of neural connections help the brain recover from damage, especially when you're a kid. There are a lot of benefits to neuroplasticity. One of the premier benefits is that it facilitates children's learning. The neural connections that are firing in children's minds are firing far quicker. They're making far more connections than adults can. And it's enabled them to learn things far quicker than adults, like language. They're like sponges for language, but virtually anything at that age. Take my son. When my son turned 4, I got him a hoverboard, which I totally regret now. But when he got on that hoverboard, he was able to ride it pretty comfortably in a few hours. It took me like a week to feel comfortable just standing on it, let alone riding it. And that's because his brain, relative to mine, is firing a 5 a minute. But this facilitation of learning isn't the only benefit of neuroplasticity. It also helps children recover from really serious forms of brain damage. Tell you a story of Michelle Mack. Michelle Mack was a child who suffered from a stroke very early on in life, which completely destroyed her left hemisphere. Which, by the way, we just got finished talking about how the left hemisphere is associated with speech, communication, language. So Michelle Mack had a difficult time communicating with other people at the same time. But fortunately for Michelle Mack, that stroke occurred for her as she was a kid, still benefiting from neuroplasticity. So much so that her right hemisphere started picking up on some of the duties of the left hemisphere. To such an extent where she was able to live a relatively normal life. She graduated high school, paid bills, made friends. Now, to be sure, Michelle Mack still needed a ton of accommodations to help her accomplish these tasks. But this is not to understate the notion that a person was able to live a relatively normal life despite one half of their brain being destroyed. That's remarkable. But the brain is not 100% prepared. By the time children enter into their teenage years, a pruning process begins to occur, where all the neural connections that they didn't use when they were kids become lost by the time you reach adulthood, and it becomes increasingly difficult to get those things back. Use it or you lose it. You guys remember the story of Jeannie? That child raised in social isolation, maltreatment, chained to her toilet or her crib, deprived of a lot of regular interaction that children have, but also not spoken language to, right? Even though Jeannie was rescued at the age of 13 and put into intense language intervention programs, she never learned the ability to speak the English language, let alone master it. Because even by the age of 13, Jeannie missed the boat for neuroplasticity. The pruning process had already started to take place, and she was never able to catch up. And I'm sure you could probably think of quite a few examples, whether it be personal examples or even things you've seen on TV or in media, of some of the benefits of neuroplasticity for children, as well as what happens to children if they miss that boat and aren't placed in a safe and stimulating environment. Right? Can any of you think of any examples you'd like to share along these lines? Yeah.
Can I becoming rusty in the language be one of them?
So we're talking about instances kind of like big developmental hurdles, where you were deprived of something, where someone you know was deprived of something early on.
Okay.
And if they were in a safe and stimulating environment, maybe they still recover as children. But if they're not in a safe and stimulating environment, maybe they miss the boat and they never recover. And those are the types of things, yeah.
So I work and I teach swim lessons. So one of our clients, he's like 23 now. When he was 15, he had like a big surgery, and when he went under anesthesia, he actually like threw a blood clot. So when he woke up, he didn't know how to speak, walk, or any like motor skills that he did have. So now over the years, like he can swim again. He's forming small sentences, but like his caregiver thinks that at one point he did know how to swim and did know how to like play drums because it came back quicker.
Right.
And some of the other skills that they're like going back.
And did you say this problem happened when he was a child or as an
He
adult?
was 15.
15,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I mean, even by 15, right, it's a little bit late for something like this. But you could bet maybe if that occurred earlier on, right, maybe we're talking at age 5, 6, and 7, maybe the recovery process later on might have been a little bit easier. Right? Who knows? Right? Age plays a big role in neuroplasticity, being able to help people recover from damage. But mostly when they're young, very young. Any other questions or comments before we conclude for today? Okay, read your textbook books, right? Give this topic